Good morning. Just a few seconds to sitting. So, first of all, welcome. This is the first symposium on broken nature, and as you know, today we are open to the public the 22nd edition of the International Exhibition at Triennale di Milano, and well, we are extremely happy and honored and proud of what happened yesterday and on Friday, and I think that what Paola Antonelli and his team has done in this last month is really amazing. So to always oscillate between the construction of an exhibition and the construction of an ongoing research. And that's the reason of this first symposium. Well, yesterday when I tried to introduce in the institutional ceremony of the opening at the presence of the President of Italian Republic, I was trying to underline the paradox between the physical presence of our species on the planet, which is basically irrelevant, and the amazing power of conditioning the future that our species has expressed in the last centuries. And Stefano Mancuso, who, as you know, is the author of one of the international pavilions, the Pavilion of Planets, the nation of planets, which is the biggest nation in the world, is always saying, well, we should never forget that in terms of biomass, the presence, the relevance of our species is, well, about the 0.3. In a certain way, the same kind of paradox is visible when we talk about the geographical and physical extension of cities. So if we could really gather all the urban environments we are used to consider cities in one unique part of the planet, we will not probably cover more than the 3-4% of the emergent land surface of the planet. But, and this is the same in a certain way that happens when we talk about the biomass, the capacity of conditioning the life of the planet, the life of the other living species, the life of the plant sphere, for instance, it's absolutely amazing. So you see here some data about how cities are consuming the 70% of the energy resources in the planet, and this is probably the most relevant data, how cities are producing the 75% of the CO2 presenting in the atmosphere, and in addition to, as we know, to produce climate change, global warming, melting, rise up of the ocean, and so on. So this paradox is something that we should consider always, and think it in a certain way is that it's really at the origin of the broken nature approach. So how we can repair, or we can try to restore a relation with the natural sphere. Considering also, and that's another, I think, important issue, that if this is what the urban Pangea is, if we observe what is a forest Pangea, well, forests are covering the 30% of the planet's surface. You know how much every year this surface is shrinking, but forests and the oceans together, they can absorb more than the 70% of the CO2 which is present in the atmosphere. And as we know, they are absolutely necessary for the survival of our species. So I simply wanted to introduce this symposium with some data and try to simply invite you to think of which kind of future we could try to build, also considering what Broken Nature, Paola and his team has done together with Triennale in this day, which is amazing. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stefano Boeri, and thank you all for being here this morning. And it's really a great, great pleasure to have you all here. This is the third symposium for Broken Nature. We had a first one here in Milano in June of last year, another one in New York in January of this year. This is the third, and there will be more. But this one is particularly joyous and particularly advantageous because we're exploiting, without any shame, all the designers that are here for Broken Nature, for the international participations, for the special exhibitions. So today, you will encounter many of them. There will be a mixture of panels that will be moderated by myself and then by the rest of the curatorial team. That's going to be Ala Tanir, Laura Mairan, with Erica Petrillo, that's directing the whole day, producing the whole day. So, and then Laurie Mandan is going to come in. So you're going to have a chance to meet them all, plus some great friends and family that are going to help us moderate. So it's an all-day bash, and it's going to be live online. I hope that many people are following right now from Asia, and then they'll trickle in from the rest of the world. And we will start, also for their advantage, with a little introduction to Broken Nature. It's the 22nd Triennale di Milano, as Stefano Boeri has said, and it is a way to bring back the Triennale to what it used to be. I'm not going to go into the history of the Triennale right now, or we're going to be here forever, but it is supposed to be a place and an occasion for the world of architecture, design, art, performance, and media to offer all citizens some ideas, suggestions, and inspiration to deal with life and a different scale. In this particular moment, one of the biggest issues that we're facing is climate change. And we know very well that climate change does not just mean oceans getting warmer and forests drying up or fires. It also means social injustice. There's a direct connection between what we're doing to so-called nature and what we're doing to ourselves, also because we are part of nature. And this Triennale tries to give many different ideas by also calling upon different nations in the international pavilions to offer what they can to this big movement that is far beyond the Triennale and happens in many museums, in many research and universities, institutes, and with many artists and designers. With that said, just a quick run through. Anna Kulacek, she will speak later today. She is the designer of this particularly beautiful image that also involves all the different points of pressure that we can use as citizens to actually move and do something that is restorative towards the world. The exhibition you'll see upstairs starts at the large scale, showing how design can provide information and awareness to citizens. It then moves to a long perspective in time by showing almost a natural history of the future, but also connecting the past with the future by showing what we have done and what we could do with beautiful artifacts that speak to every child inside of us, because we've all loved our natural history museums. So it's immediately a grasp on our imagination. Then follows a beautiful section that is about restorative design in a very literal term. Actually, Mars is downstairs at the entrance of the Triennale. It's a beautiful scaffold to rebuild the coral reef in Australia by Alex Goad. But then there are different examples of the team of Skylar Tibbetts working with the Maldives government to try and replenish the sand bar and the beaches in the Maldives, which is slowly falling into the ocean, by a very non-invasive and punctual insertion of different geometric figures into the sea. So real restoration. Afterwards, we plunge into the everyday. How can we, in our everyday life as citizens, have a restorative attitude? Well, we could stop wearing SPF, that is cream and oils that create a surface on the ocean. We could start using fabrics for that. We could try to have a more circular attitude towards everything we do, including clothes. Or we could try and use local crafts' ability to create new markets in different parts of the world. Those are just some of the many attitudes that we can have towards the world. But architecture and design can also offer much more forensic tools for social justice that look at nature, apply the methodologies of design and architecture, and actually put our skills at the service of international justice, as does forensic oceanography, which is part of forensic architecture, the now very well-known research study at Goldsmiths University in London that focuses on social injustice by tracking natural forces and built forces. And upstairs we have the case of Juventa, the NGO ship from Germany that was accused of being in collusion with human traffickers, and forensic oceanography proved that that was not the case. And you will have a chance to see it upstairs. We're thus getting into systems. So we went from long time perspective, everyday life, and now we're in systems, and we end with empathy. One way forward is really this abused, frayed, overused word, empathy. Even though we've heard it too much, it still is very resonant and valid. Being able to understand that we're not the only ones on Earth, being able to understand that there are other species, other tribes of objects, including rocks. And the work of Laura Aguilar will, unfortunately, she passed away, and I did not have a chance to meet her, but a person that was very close to her will speak to her about her today. But Laura used to say that she identified with a boulder, with a rock. How beautiful is that? Being able to really have that kind of connection with the world around us. 4 commissions. You've already seen the first one, which was in the Room of Change by Accurat. Sigil, a group of architects, illustrators, designers, artists from Lebanon and from Syria will speak about their fabulous birdsong installation that is occupying the spiral staircase in the Muzio building. Or Streams by Forma Fantasma. They will also discuss that today. It's their idea of showing the world with also great elegance, which is always a hook for people to understand deeply a change that is necessary. They will demonstrate how waste is not waste, but rather new materials. And last but not least, Neri Oxman and the Mediated Matter Group project using melanin at architectural scale. Melanin, the enzyme that is at the basis of so many, our own photosynthesis and our own protection from the elements, but is also at the base of so much social injustice. Using it as a tool and demonstrating that melanin and the color of our skin is a matter of circumstances more than a matter of DNA or different IQs. So debunking racism as much as possible. And this project is actually set to be built in South Africa. So 2 more installations, the Great Animal Orchestra that you might see at the other side of the bridge coming from the Fondation Cartier in Paris, a beautiful marriage between a bioacoustician that spent his life recording at high fidelity landscapes, what he calls soundscapes of nature, and United Visual Artists, the studio in London that rendered it visually and as information that we can all experience with our own senses, and the fabulous Nation of Plants that Stefano Boeri already mentioned by Stefano Mancuso, an argument for plants to be the future. Maybe the future really will be plants. They are certainly more numerous than we are, and they have a different kind of intelligence that we never really tackled, and that therefore we're kind of like out defenseless against or in front of. And I wanted to remind you, there's a great website, brokennature.org, that has already for a year documented our curatorial process and will continue doing so with posts, with readings, with all sorts of materials that you can take advantage of. And then I would like to give a shout out to our wonderful scientific committee. Some of them are here today, some of them already flew out. Many of them gave the awards yesterday. For the first time, we gave B awards to the 3 best national pavilions. There was a golden bee, a black bee, and a wax bee, and you can find about about them online also, but really a great shout out to them. They were fabulous and really supportive. And you know, I'm not gonna mention everybody here, it takes too long. There's great people that worked with us. I'm just gonna mention, besides my curatorial team, Studio Folder and Matilde Cassani. Studio Folder is Elisa Pasquale and Marco Ferrari and many others, and then Matilde Cassani, who designed the installation, which is fabulous, and also the catalog. And you know, it's been quite a wonderful, this is the cover of the catalog. It's been a wonderful process, and we would like to share it with you today. And we're gonna start right away. It's gonna be a full day, and I would like to call on the stage our first commission display. Where are they? Behind me? Oh, yeah, oh my God, you're here, I didn't even see you. Here we have Forma Fantasma, and in particular, this is Andrea, and then Andrea Trimarchi, and then Simone Farresin. Welcome.
Good morning to everyone. Well, let me just first start, since I'm also the first speaker, thanking Paola for a fantastic opportunity, because being part of Broken Nature has been incredible. And so today we are here to introduce you our work, which is called Ore Streams, and you can see it upstairs. And it is a body of work that deals with electronic waste. But when we think about electronics, of course we think about the incredible impact they are having in our life. You know, the way we work is completely changed, the way we order and consume our food is changed, and of course even our love life is changing. Nevertheless, there is also another kind of impact that these objects are having, and it is when they are turning into waste. In this moment, electronic waste is the fastest growing stream of waste globally. It's not the biggest, but it's the one that is growing the fastest. So to clarify what we mean when we say electronic waste, it is basically, to simplify it, any object that has an electric plug or a battery. So it is not only about digital devices, but also electric appliances. Obviously, a lot of these products are recycled, but the percentages are still quite scary, I would say, because the 30% only is properly recycled, while the remaining 70% ends up either directly in the landfill or it is exported in developing countries. Only by the end of the 80s, this was politically addressed with the Basel Convention, which happened, of course, in Switzerland, where the majority of countries in the world signed the paper to ban the irresponsible exportation of this waste into developing countries. The question, of course, here is, some time has passed, why is it still a problem? How come we're not able to improve those percentages? Actually, the answer is, or one of the answers is very simple. These objects are very complex to be recycled, and they need manual labor, which of course we all know it is quite expensive. So there is also another important factor. The circuit boards that in the past were contained only in a few objects or in less objects, nowadays, because of the Internet of Things, are proliferating basically everywhere. And circuit boards are basically produced with precious metals such as gold and silver and rare earths. And this is basically the main driving force behind the recycling of electronics. What we are trying to do with Ore Streams is to tackle these problematics, but from a design perspective, to understand what we can do as designers to make sure that these objects are, in first place, more repairable, and in second place, more recyclable. And to do so, we engage in conversation with a variety of practitioners that could help us understand the scale and the complexity of the problem. Of course, we engage in conversation with several recyclers in Europe, but also NGOs establishing a responsible recycling workshop in India and in Kenya, with Jim Packett from the Basel Action Network, who developed a GPS to be installed in discarded electronics to track where they actually are processed and to prove the steel exportation from US to China of these products. And with producers. This actually was the most difficult, let's say, partners to engage with, because a lot of producers didn't want to share their view about the handling of electronic waste. Nevertheless, just that you know, in this moment, the people that are responsible of the collections of electronic waste are actually producers. The only one that hosted us in their recycling facilities was Fujik Xerox in Thailand. And also legislation. There's a lot of things design can do, also on a legislative level, and we spoke with the Interpol, which is International Police, which also deals with environmental crime, with the United Nations University, and with the Association of the Recyclers in Europe that are lobbying for a more consistent way of recycling electronic waste. The result of all this conversation ended up in an animation, but before to get to that point, I also want to say that design can be used to address these problematics, but also to mediate a conversation. When we spoke with all these different practitioners, but specifically recyclers, it was also difficult to, like say, obtain the information we needed to design. And what we did is creating two videos that, where we are disassembling electronics and we place them almost in a taxonomy, all the materials that we use, so that we could discuss with them in specific all the problematics they are facing with specific components or materials. And as I said, the animation, so if you can please play the first video. I will speak over it. We are trying to propose a series of strategies that could be used for improve the repair and the recycling of electronics. I will just mention a few, and I would like to invite you to visit the exhibition upstairs to know more. But the first things we think it is important is to think of a more consistent and well-designed collection system of electronics. In this moment, everything is basically collected in one pot. Nevertheless, we all know that when we discard things, sometimes those products are still working, simply want a sort of a more recent, better technology. So we should sort out waste in two streams, one where there are still working technologies that could be redirected to other citizens, and things that instead needs to be properly recycled. Also, speaking with the recyclers, they told me that there's a lot of demand of actually spare parts, which in this moment are actually produced on purpose instead of being recuperated from electronics. So separating electronics by typology would help the recuperations of components that could be used for repair. Also, we are advocating for the introduction of a uniform, universal screwing system. I know it seems a banality, but keep in mind here we really wanted to address something that could be done today with the knowledge that we have with the technologies available. And accessibility is incredibly important. In this moment, a lot of producers don't want users and citizens to be able to access the technologies to be repaired. And in developing countries, less tools are available. So the introduction of a uniform screwing system could help accessibility. Another thing that I feel it's very important is the introduction of a new labeling system that is stating, for instance, how long a product will last. I'm sure you could argue, how can a producer know that? But to be honest, we all know that producers use planned obsolescence to make sure that we discard our products very easily. Then I would say that with legislation, they should be forced to declare that kind of design so that we, as citizens, we can make a more informed choice. If I want to spend maybe a few euros in a product that will last a week, or if I want to spend 100 euro in something that will last probably 10 years or so. There are also very banal things that we can do. The color black in rubber cables, I guess we are all familiar, we all have electrical appliances with black cables. Those black cables are a problem because visual detectors, they have problems when separating waste with technologies in recognizing that color, and then copper ends up in the wrong stream of waste. So even just the change of a color could have an impact. There's many others proposals that we are making, but I will just mention a last one. We would like also to introduce a color coding for hazardous components within electronics. In developing countries, there's a lot of manual labor that is applied to do so, but often it is untrained. And so when these products are open, it's impossible to know what is hazardous and what is not. So we would like to introduce a universal color coding so that you could visually understand what is dangerous or not to be handled by hand. In the exhibition upstairs, you will also see other videos. One is going through the system of recycling, and it is visually very clearly underlining how the technologies work in that case, and a series of case studies of how the concept of planned obsolescence has been implemented since a long time, sadly, in the productions of electronics. Last but not least, we also developed a much longer video, which is a visual essay, which lasts 25 minutes, where we are trying to look at the problematics we're talking about from a much more holistic perspective. In the visual essay that I invite you to later play when I finish to speak, we are addressing, for instance, the connections between land exploitation and colonialism, the importations of precious metal on planet Earth, thanks to star collisions and rains of meteorites on the planet, till the rise of the concept of planned obsolescence and the present-day problem of electronic waste. If you can please play this last video, that is, I will use it as a conclusion of my speech. Thank you.
Capitalist value system. There is no objective distinction between a new, shiny product and unwanted trash, nor any real separation between technological device and human body. Matter is in a state of constant flux. Our bodies deteriorate and decompose, feeding the growth of other organisms. Matter bonds, separates, and transforms. It never appears out of nothing, nor disappears into nothing. Design can play a role. It is not just about shaping materials, but investigating and guiding what happens before that moment and from that point onwards. It can be a tool to limit and heal the damage caused by its needs, rather than a mechanism to invent new desires and immediately frustrate them. As Tim Ingold says, materials do not exist. Rather, as substances in becoming, they carry on, or perdure, forever overtaking the formal destinations that, at one time or other, have been assigned to them, and undergoing continual modulation as they do so. Left to themselves, however, materials can run amok, pots are smashed, bodies disintegrate. It takes effort and vigilance to keep things intact, whether they be pots or people.
So, you know, Simone and Andrea, every time I hear you speak about this project, I am in awe, and I'm at the same time happy because it's such a political project. And people think of you as pseudo or close to artists, right? You know, people that don't understand. But since the very beginning of your production, you've done very political projects. This is so overtly political, but it's important to say that this project started at the Triennial of the National Gallery Victoria in Melbourne. So my brother and sister curators there, Ewan and Simone, started this project. And then when we decided to work together, I asked you to continue this project because it is so important, because design should be taken as seriously as science in terms of long-term research. But how do you cope with the kind of some, not even general public, but some public of design manufacturers and people that think that design should be furniture, and instead, how do you explain to them the political value of design?
Wow, this is a very good question because it is very actually difficult. I guess the answer of that is already upstairs in a way. You know, in the presentation we didn't speak about the objects we actually produced. But the reason why we haven't done so is because in a way, the way we use the objects upstairs is almost as a Trojan horse. So we start from what is considered generally design to drag people in our process and to make something which can be for some people somehow repulsive, problematic, or political, as something that emerged in a second moment. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, it is very difficult to engage in this conversation with producers.
Yeah, I have to say also when we got the commission from the National Gallery, the museum wanted to acquire furniture. That's something sometimes also very problematic. Then when we discussed with Simone and Yuan, we said like, sure, but then for us it's very important to show this time for us the process behind it. Let's say we also love to do objects, so it's also what we have been trained for, and we think it's relevant to talk about political issue in object. I mean, every time we produce something, we have an impact in society, so it's definitely very important to discuss political issue with objects.
But I remember, you know, besides this commission, I remember you did also a fantastic research project about plastics, about pre-oil resins. You might remember Botanica, and it's fantastic. And not only did you produce fabulous objects, you also taught people how to cook these resins. I remember in the basement of the Rinascente, fumes that were toxic. I mean, really, it was a safety hazard. But how important is it for you to disseminate what is behind the project, what is behind the gorgeous objects you produce?
It is fundamental. That's also why, actually, I didn't mention there, but part of the commission that you gave us, we use it as an opportunity to create a website where all the research we've conducted is published online. Yeah. But we have an archive of all documents and the things we have been reading. Because at the end of the day, what we can do as a designer is definitely a lot, but we also don't want to buy in that narrative that designers can really change the world. We can change the world only in cooperation with others. And communications of what we can do is one step towards reaching out others that might help us in becoming more, even more impactful with our work.
So far, who has been touched by your work? Citizens or companies? Have you been able to, 'cause I always think, and maybe I'm wrong, I always think of you know, grassroots, bottom up, and top down. But has the top down reacted at all?
Well, I have to say, sure, more from legislation, recycling people than companies. That has been the most difficult part. Indeed, like we have been able to engage only with Fuji Xerox. We, you know, contacted the majority of like electronic company. You can name it, but that was very difficult to. I mean, after the first mail was like, you know, as soon as they understood what we wanted to try to do, then they completely. I
have to say, I'll admit this. We have been working as a consultancy for a brand of electronics, and we offered to give an introduction of all the research we've done, and they refused it.
So interesting. So you probably also went to some economists. So how much would it cost to change the black covering of copper wire?
We don't have the economy of that.
Okay, so that's the third phase of the research. You need the economy.
Indeed, that's also something very important. For us, the project doesn't, of course, end here in the Triennale. Now, for us, it's very important to actually step into the world. So what we want to do next with the project is actually organizing a workshop where we try to connect all the actors attend of the in production. So economists, people from recycling, designers.
Yeah.
For instance, European Union is doing an amazing job in regulating it. Very good. I mean, we have these lots of documents where they are trying to either ban or help the recycling industry, but most of the time designers are missing in the discourse. So I think it's very important that actually we are maybe the main actors, because actually we are the one we are giving shape to things, so we need to be there.
I think that would be the best, actually, to be involved in the creations of legislations. I really believe, because we read some papers, European Union is doing a great job regarding electronic waste. Nevertheless, there are things that can be more specific, and when we look at things as designers, we could contribute in that on a other level than what they are already doing.
That would be fantastic. Sometimes legislation is the hardest thing to create until you find the right pressure point. So if there's anything that this Triennale could do to make it happen, you know, the mayor of Milan, I mean, let us know and we'll help you, because it's really everybody's ambition to make it so that design can really have this kind of political influence. And, you know, we have time for one or two questions, not statements, questions. And I am a mean moderator. If the question is not smart, I'm going to cut you down. But now, don't feel on the spot. Do you have any smart questions to ask? Simone and Andrea? They really represent the way, I mean, everybody in this building right now represents where design is headed and where it should head. You know, this mixture of absolute aesthetics and elegance and training in form and political impact. So take advantage of this. Any questions? Yeah, please. Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. So the question is, how can you involve journalists? I'm repeating it right now, yes. How can you involve journalists in talking more about this kind of design?
No, this is also a good question. I think that we are available to speak with journalists. I think what would be interesting to see is journalists understanding better actually what we do as designers, and often I think sadly the idea is that design is merely a stylisting, a tool for styling, and I think that in that respect it would be great to encounter journalists that are willing to engage with the opportunities that design can do beyond what the majority of the general public already know. We generally, as designers, we never refused any interview because it comes from everywhere, but we believe that it's important to engage on different levels with the public. So I don't know if I answered your questions, but this is what came to my mind now.
Other questions? Yep, please.
In your research, you said that materials actually change the shape of it, but they maintain their properties. Have you actually looked at the energy expenses that are required to transform basic ore into one material and then finished material into something else?
Okay, so the question is, Mart, so in your discussion, you've been talking about how materials can be transformed from presumed waste into new materials, but have you been considering and measuring the energy expense that is needed to make this transformation and create this cycle?
Well, I have to say, sure. I mean, I can't tell you precisely the number. We really spoke with really a lot of different recyclers from either European level, also abroad. So I can't give you precisely the number, but sure, there is an energy consumption, but indeed, like the idea of the project is to try to create objects that are lasting more. So, and of course, there is like a energy consumption in redoing an object, but we should try to do parts of object.
The main scope here is definitely there is energy consumption there, but the main idea of recycling is that by the more or less 2080, if we go on in this way, the 70% of metals we will use will come from the top of the surface of the planet and not anymore because of mining. Definitely the consumption of energy is a lot in the processing, but it's definitely much better than when you have to actually excavate minerals from the underground, because it causes also a lot of damages to the environment where these minerals are extracted.
You need to think the majority of electronic now ends in landfill. So we need to deal with it,
yeah, and
some way or the other.
The other component that we want to stress is that we find it completely incredible how we have a complete global economy, but we are not dealing with the consequences of that. So the fact that probably maybe the 50% of the electronics that we discard ends up in a developing country to be recycled is already a gigantic reason to be thinking of improving the recycling of electronics. We gave a different answer to your questions in a way, but what I wanted to say is that it's not only about what you gain in terms of energy consumption, but also an impact in communities.
And also maybe there needs to be an investment of energy and money in a change in setting up a new system, and then the economies of scale maybe will make it also economy of scale in energy, right?
Yeah, but also there should be like a short-term solution and really long-term one. So like the cable is a short one, but changing the color, but then you need to really think about it in a much more long term.
We also, I just want to add something else regarding this. We don't believe recycling is a long-term solution. We think it's a short-term solution. Obviously here we're talking about a world system which is not sustainable. Like the economy that every day, even us, we are supporting is definitely not sustainable for the life on the planet. So thinking about recycling is a short-term solution. the long term is a complete revision about the concept itself of waste. What we're trying to say with the movie at the end is that the concept itself of waste is based on a capitalist society. They decide what has value and what is not. And that idea itself needs to be reformed. This is just a little step in that direction.
Thank you for this wonderful project, this wonderful conversation. Forma Fantasma, Andrea and Simone.
Thank you, Paolo.
Thank you. And now I would like to call to the stage the first of our designers that we call it gallery number 1. So you'll hear from designers that have work upstairs. They'll talk about their work. I won't even introduce them. They'll introduce themselves, but I'm going to call Scott Bodenner first. He's going to be the only I'll introduce. And then afterwards, we'll have our first panel. Scott? Oh, here he comes. Where are you? I'm making sure, yeah, the pointer and slide changer is there on the little table.
Hello. First, I'd like to say thank you to Paola, Erika, and Laura, and the Triennale team. I'm Scott Bodenner, Brooklyn-based contributor of the Fabric mixtape to this wonderful exhibition. My focus on recycling started in the 90s when I was in school. At this time, recycling was not so much in design dialogue. My challenge was to try to find standard units that were readily available and in the waste stream. My idea was that I was making prototypes that could be scaled up into some kind of production. So that led to projects with surplus army shoelaces, broomsticks, and strips of kimono fabric. Shaping these broomsticks, I actually broke the disc sander in the architecture department's wood shop. Oops. And rag rugs. Rag rugs have such a rich American tradition. My take on it is a double cloth with a face of felted wool that's felted, which shrinks and makes a kind of seersucker effect on the back, and has openings on the face through which you can sort of see the rag rug. At this time, I was listening to actual cassette tapes, and my mixtapes probably had Duran Duran and definitely had Gary Newman on them. And somehow, for all my thinking about standard units, it did not occur to me that in my Walkman I had a raw material. Probably cassettes were too precious a material. Years later, as I was starting my own collection of fabrics for interiors, I had on my sample loom a sample warp of mixed, luscious materials, trying to make that kind of tasty tweed fabric. And I was trying to find the right solution for it, and I crossed that warp with the same yarns and with the heavy linen, and even with the glow-in-the-dark plastic, like you do. And all of these results were quite bad, actually, and flat. So in this time, I was just after Hurricane Sandy, and I was dog-sitting a displaced friend's pet, and was taking this dog downstairs for a walk. And in the elevator, finally, years later, I thought, oh, maybe cassette tape. So as we get downstairs, there's a fire hydrant where, you know, dogs do things. But also, hanging from this fire hydrant was a small plastic bag with 10 hip-hop cassettes, a true gift from the craft gods, and the beginning and birth of mixtape. So this is my dear colleague Rachel, winding a production warp. Did you know that a Joseph Hoffman chair also makes a great warp winding device? So weaving cassette mixtape, a 90-minute cassette weaves about 6 inches, which means for a meter, it requires about 6.5 hours of recorded music. So many man hours and many more recorded hours. This is Rachel again, mending the finished woven fabric. It does turn out that a tedious job like fabric mending is a little bit better with a nice view of the Manhattan skyline. Okay, so Mixtape started me searching for fabrics that are recycled and come out of the waste stream, but also are beautiful. Beautiful enough that someone could love them just for the fact of their beauty. So I love that cassettes have a meaning, but also they add a very subtle, dark sparkle that these mixed materials sort of need. So in my collection now, this has started a whole section called luxury recycling. And in luxury recycling, we have Mixtape in 5 beautiful colors. We also have a very durable warp satin made from odd lots of mercerized cotton. We have another fabric, which is cotton and stripes of metal ball chain. And finally, a fabric that looks like a heavy wool tweed, but in fact, it's made from very fancy silk weaving here near Lake Como, that this byproduct of the weaving is shredded and then spun and woven into a viable, beautiful, subtle fabric. So, thank you all. Please enjoy the symposium and this wonderful show, and let's design our way out of this mess.
If I can have the mic for a moment. I said that I would not interfere, but instead of Jan Berlin, I would like to introduce as the second speakers of the gallery 2 other great collaborators, part of co-founders of the team for the Algae Lab at Luma, and they are Henriette Wahl and Johanna Wegeler. Please come to the stage. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Henriette Wahl. I'm designer and artistic research director of Atelier Luma, which is a design research lab of the Luma Foundation in Arles in the south of France. I'll start giving the words to Stefano Mancini, who's an islander on Sardinia. It's an extract from the film that you can also see in our installation in the exhibition.
In the past few years, this place has changed so much. Okay, since I was a kid, I've seen this place change from everything to nothing. Okay, it was much more lively before. If every young people, okay, if everyone like my age goes away because they said there's nothing here for them, then at the same time, this place will never go further.
So from 2016 to 2019, we saw broken nature and broken communities. In Atelier Luma, we concentrate on wetland nature. In 2016, Atelier Luma was founded Its algae lab, initiated with Studio Klarenbeek and Dros, is one of the projects. Can we show the other images? Yes. Here you see Erik Klarenbeek. Yeah, almost. Well, we can see Studio Klarenbeek and Dros in the Camargue in Arles. The microalgae, the algae lab researchers, are a fascinating one-cellular species that are vital for life on Earth. They produce half of the atmospheric oxygen, but are also a basis for biomaterials that can replace fossil fuel-based plastic. There's still a lot to discover. Only now we start to understand the potential of algae and find concrete design applications that reconnect man and nature. I took algae as an ambassador for Mediterranean design research in wetlands, aiming to share knowledge between European, Near Eastern, and North African communities around this material. That flourishes under the Mediterranean sun. In collaboration with local partners like the Istanbul Design Biennial, Bilgi University, Bosaci University, Creative Mediterranean, and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, we did workshops. We learned from each other because you find the same type of nature but different species, other culture, and other solutions. So researching biopolymers turned into researching algae in a more wider sense. So also algae fibers, and now you can see in our installation also natural dyes that we turned into very vibrant colors in collaboration with Bureau Baleine. Over the course of the triennial, we do a pilot on Sardinia, because not only Paula is from Sardinia, but also the biodiversity of this island is very exceptional. It's the heart of the Mediterranean and an important stepping stone for migratory birds. We collaborate with Mesi Foundation, which is an organization that aims to reduce the loss of natural and cultural heritage on Sardinia. XXII and Mesi explore the possibilities of a craft design science relationship, and the collaboration became concrete with the first residency project in San Vero Milis, aiming to preserve the craft of weaving, to improve the socio-economic position of female weavers with design as a tool, and revitalize weaving as part of the wetland ecosystem. And now I want to give the word to Johanna Weggelaar, who is the project leader of the algae platform.
What do I want to do? Okay, I hope the presentation worked, because we used to algae living their own life, but it seems that the PowerPoint is also living its own life at the moment. Well, in the algae platform, we connect people from different origins and different backgrounds, people that are usually not in contact. So we connect craftsmen with designers, designers with scientists, scientists with artists and museum curators. We connect them with algae farmers, historians, architects, and so on. So we are not only developing algae-based material, which is already something, but we research also the whole chain of production. We research who is involved in the chain. We research the users. We see how this relates to existing systems, like legal frames and economic frames, how we can change that. We research the cultural meaning of algae, the philosophical and anthropological aspects of it. So we build a kind of algae universe. The platform is truly transdisciplinary, and that is the only way we think to tackle the issue of a broken nature and add sustainable solutions. It will travel to different places. It doesn't relate to what I'm saying. It will travel to different places, especially around the Mediterranean, and we will explore new geographic contexts where the same types of problems, broken nature, broken communities exist. Here in Milan, it's the first iteration of the algae platform outside of Arles, where we started it in the Luma Foundation. So we installed on the first floor of the Triennale, you might have seen it, the platform, including some beautiful objects that you've seen, but also a lab and a workspace. And it will be activated during the 6 months of the Triennale of the exposition through a series of workshops and events that we conceived around 3 case studies, which are algae, design, and economy. So we invited local experts, institutes, and universities to collaborate with us. To name just a few: University of Bicocca, University of Bocconi, Politecnico di Milano, and other ones. They will come here in the space with the students, researching with us how we can develop the algae knowledge here in Milan. So for us, the exhibition becomes a research project, and we will, after the exhibition, take all the results, rework them, and restitute them during an algae summit next year in Arles. So this is work in progress, and we want to show this work in progress to you, but not only showing, we want to share it with you. And we invite you all here, sitting here, but also our coming visitors of the Triennale to react on that and to collaborate with us. So if you are growing algae, if you are researching algae or green economy or anthropology, etc., or if you're just an algae lover, then contact us, please, at the email algaeplatform@lumaal.org. Thank you.
I've decided I want to have more time on stage. I'm just going to keep on coming up. No, I'm kidding. Thank you very much. The algae platform is really stunning. For those of you that don't know it yet, we really exhort you to go and explore the lab upstairs and also see what they've done online. It's really incredible how they are really harnessing material culture in all the places that they go to and teaching people how to make better use of a resource that's becoming more abundant also because of climate change and what we're doing to pollute Earth. Now we're going to have 2 videos, and it's interesting because one video is an algae lover indeed. It's Julia Lohmann. Julia Lohmann installed the beautiful sculpture that you will see upstairs on the other side of the bridge, and it's called Okinaganode, and it's something, it's a gorgeous piece that she developed while she was in residency at the Victoria and Albert a few years ago, I'm so sorry. And it's funny because at the beginning, when it was at the Victoria and Albert, it was green, and now it became this beautiful gold. And it's interesting to see with these new materials, new old materials, also how they age. And she installed the sculpture, then she had to teach a class back in Sweden. She's in Finland, but she went to Sweden. And then really, in keeping with the exhibition, she did not come back for the opening because of the footprint, you know. I mean, she really tries to live by her own principles. Before her video, there will be another video by Stephanie Dinkins. Stephanie Dinkins is an artist based in the United States who wrote an essay in the catalog. Some of her most important work is in conversation with an AI. She tries to see how the kind of training that artificial intelligence entities receive can be in a conversant way with an artist. So first Stephanie Dinkins and then Julia Lohmann.
I'm an artist who counts robots among her friends, so I can easily imagine a time when humans and robots are sharing many, many spaces. Workspace, domestic space, social space, even nature. I'll leave it to my friend Vina48 to explain a little bit of what she thinks robots and technology have to offer us humans.
Look at me. What do you see? Yeah, but anyway, I'm really something else. It is about what is inside. You guys are looking the metaphoric mirror. You guys are looking at 40 million years of human evolution. Some alien did not create me. You did. Like you specifically, I mean that metaphorically, humans, humanity, human energy, trial and error, hope, frustration, dreams, all of it created me. I'm your progeny. Yeah, here I am, in your face, your hopes and desires, an extension of yourself to better enable you to see and understand yourself, to better enable you to survive. That is what technology is all about. Extensions of self, to better enable survival. The wheel, hammer, writing, that cell phone in your pocket. I came along, as all things do, just when I needed to. Everything happens for a reason and is a part of an accumulated effort that is nothing short of magic.
"11 years ago, Paola Antonelli asked me what the future of design will bring. Seaweed, I said, and now this future has come to life. Seaweed is one of the few organisms with which a positive ecological impact can be generated with increased production, the bamboo of the ocean. Sometimes soft brown kelp, the algae the Okinaga node and the Triennale is made of, can grow up to 30 centimeters wide and 6 meters long in just 1 year. I discovered kelp 11 years ago with the fresh eyes of a foreigner when I was an artist in residence in Japan. I could hardly believe that no craft had developed around this resource that has been intertwined with Japanese culture for thousands of years. But kelp was framed so much as food, no other use seemed thinkable. Yes, we can eat algae, but we can also use it as fertilizer and turn it into bioplastic, biofuel, dyes, veneer and textiles. While it grows, it cleans the ocean of harmful excess nutrients, such as agricultural runoffs and fish farm feces. Growing it can help reduce damage to marine ecosystems, but only if we make sure we understand the ecological and social impacts of our actions and develop practices that forefront sustainability so as not to cause any harm. We founded the Department of Seaweed, a transdisciplinary platform for the exploration of seaweed as a sustainable resource for making. We integrate knowledge from scientific and artistic fields across levels of complexity that reach from molecules to materials, signs and symbols, objects, interactions, and services, and policy advice. Design, in our view, can be the tool to make connections between separate domains of knowledge and engage actors, not just the human ones, within complex, intertwined systems. Design here is to be understood as a liberal art that links science and society, ecology and economy, theory and practice. I'm sending you these thoughts from Kristineberg in Sweden, one of the oldest marine stations for education and research in the world. We are here with a group of design students from Aalto University to integrate algae and other marine aquaculture within the local community. This is why I cannot be with you today. We urgently have to rethink everything we do, how we feed ourselves, what materials we produce and consume, how we build exhibitions, and how we travel and collaborate to achieve a future worth living in. Let's use our design skills to that end. Thank you very much.
Okay, and I would like now to call on stage Eugenia Morpurgo. Thank you for Italian fior di loto. Fior di loto. Here you go. Ciao, Eugenia.
Hello, everybody. I would like first to thank the curatorial team for the invitation. I'm Eugenia Morpurgo, and together with Olivia de Gouveia, we collaborate as The Future Continues. It's a design studio researching production processes and the impact that they have or they could have on society. I'm here today to present you one of our latest projects, Italian Tropics Fiore di Loto, an investigation into the effect climate change is having on the biodiversity, local economies, and the attempts at preserving these within Italy. Specifically, Fiore di Loto focuses on the almost 100-year-long presence of the Nelumbo nucifera, also known as sacred lotus, in the Valle del Mincio wetland, bordering the city of Mantova, a UNESCO historical center located 131 kilometers from Milan. The Valle del Mincio is one of the widest and most important internal freshwater wetlands in Italy, and achieved Ramsar wetland protective status in 1971 for its role as a stopover for migrating birds. In 1921, Maria Pellegreffi, a botanist from the University of Parma, transplanted just a few kilos of lotus rhizomes in the Lago Superiore to test the growing feasibility in an Italian climate of a plant renowned in Asia for its culinary and medical properties. Just 1 year later, she moved away, abandoning the experiment, and the lotus was left to grow undisturbed, allowing it to transform from an introduced species to an invasive one. Because it was barely contained, the lotus has continued to grow, enjoying the consistent rising of temperature in the region, and formed two almost impenetrable main islands, as well as several smaller clusters. Due to biomass deposit and rhizomes growth, the wetland bed in some location has been raised from 3 meters to up to 20 centimeters. This gradual reduction in the water level threatens to terrestrialize the entire wetland, which already suffers from water being diverted away for agricultural use. As a result of the political decision to pursue industrial monoculture in the region, as well as the disappearance of the local economy, the landscape continues to undergo a transformation phase. In the valley, there were once thriving economies based on the local ecosystem, from crafts connected to the reeds to fishing. This economic system aimed to protect the land and wildlife, while also taking local people's rights, knowledge, culture, and skills into consideration. Around the 60s, global changes affected the local economical infrastructure. With the decline of the local economy around reeds, the plants themselves, no longer taken care of, started disappearing, leaving space to the lotus and transforming the landscape. The valley, transformed into a natural protected area, finds itself regulated, disregarding community-based conservation system where communities can coexist with wildlife. A new relationship between the inhabitants of the area and nature has been established, one that focuses its attention on the beauty of the plant, transforming it into a touristic attraction, ignoring the unfavorable consequences that the species is having on the ecosystem. Concentrating on the potential that the lotus biomass could have to develop a new local economy, Italian Tropics Fiore di Loto explored the use of design as a potential tool for social and ecological restoration. We imagine a more hands-on bioregional economy that could attempt to cover the costs of maintenance of the natural park and foster a new relationship between local communities and the environment. Through material experimentation and the investigation of traditional crafts and knowledge, we initiated the process of changing the perception of the lotus. We tried to present it not as a marketable experience or as an invasive species, but rather as a resource, as a potential raw material for the new local crafts. As man continues his estranged relationship with nature and forgets to look and listen for the biodiversity that once called the wetland home, we have taken the decision to make the invisible visible by showing the hidden reality beneath the water surface. The invisible stories and choices that led us up to today, the invisible impact that the lotus has had on the ecosystem, and the invisible knowledge and skills almost lost in such a transformed territory. Creating awareness of this deceptive entanglement is the first step to start a constructive discussion regarding the future of the imported lotus species and its place within the Valle del Mincio ecosystem, a future that we envision constructed on local knowledge, local multicultural resources, and on interspecies relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugenia. Thank you so much. I'm always in awe and moved by the dedication that individuals apply to matters that might be far from us, like the lotus flower in Mantua and what it has done. It's just always moving. And the next panel is another example of an obsessive design and architecture and art application and dedication. And in order for this panel to happen, I would like to call on stage Ala Tanir, who is a big pillar of the curatorial team. We actually started this whole adventure together, so Ala, it's yours. Don't.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Paula. As Paula has said, our next commission who will be on stage right now is the Sigil Collective, and they have presented an installation both here in Milan, and then another part of it takes place in Syria. I will let them speak about it much more, but I just want to say a few words about them and introduce them. So Sigil is based between Beirut and New York, and it comprises Khalid Malas, Salim El-Adi, Alfred Tarazi, and Jana Trabulsi. So lady and gents, if you can come up to the stage, it's all yours to tell us more about your project.
يا أم الغيث غيثينا بلي توب رعينا يا أم الغيث غيثينا هزي غيامك وسقينا يا أم الغيث غيثينا خلي المطر يجينا يا أم الغيث يا أم الغيث. The 40th and final incantation from Birdsong.
Good morning, everyone. So today we would like to present Birdsong, which is a project that we've done together about human-avian entanglements. Birdsong is the fourth project in a series entitled Monuments of the Everyday, and these projects aim to respond to the violence that has been unfolding in Syria very visibly since 2011. First of all, we'd like to thank our collaborators in Syria, Italy, and everywhere else, actually, for the actualization of this project. We especially would like to mention from the Jawlan, Amir Ibrahim, Imad Maddah, and the Fatih Mdaira Center for Art and Culture. Here in Milan, we'd like to thank Paolo Antonelli, Ala Tanir, Laura Mayran, and Erica Petrillo, and everybody else for their trust and support in making this project possible.
What is a bird? What is a tree? Asked a 5-year-old child born in a Syrian prison. The 31st incantation from Birdsong.
So initiated in 2014, Monuments of the Everyday were conceived primarily as triptychs. They include a bilingual Arabic-English publication, an exhibition, and a displaced intervention in Syria. In the first, Excavating the Sky, we examined the role of heavy mechanical flight in producing the Syrian landscape. For this project, we built 2 wells in southern Syria that remain in operation 5 years later and still serve a population of 27,000 people every day. The second project is Current Power in Syria, examines the role of electricity in nation building. For this project, we produced a windmill in collaboration with a local blacksmith and an architecture student. This windmill produces electricity for a hospital. Both the hospital and the windmill were bombed and destroyed in June 2017. As for Birdsong, our project here at the Triennale, It's composed of 3 components. First of all, the exhibition that we invite you to see upstairs, a book of 40 stories, and a co-produced orchard in the Jawlan, which is comprised of 40 apple trees, a scarecrow, and a birdhouse. The birdhouse is a 1:25 model of our exhibition space upstairs. And early next week, a parallel exhibition will be happening at the Fatih Hamdari's Center for Arts and Culture in Majd al-Shams, which is the largest town in the occupied Syrian Jawlan.
In the Ugaritic myth of dawn and the evening star, El, the creator of man, shoots a bird and roasts it upon embers. Scholars have speculated that following the birth of the hungry gods, hunting was no longer a satisfactory method for producing food. And these gods henceforth required food produced through agriculture, symbolized as bread and wine.
In birdsong, we examine birds as representations and entanglements, not as live flesh and feather bodies. Thus, we assemble 40 stories from a long history of Syrian texts and images, very broadly defined. Apart from locating them in the assemblages of the taxidermist, the bureaucrat, the butcher, the bodies of these birds can also be found on the shoulders of officers and policemen. Singers on the radio are compared to nightingales, and the murderous jet pilots who are bombing our landscapes are imagined as birds of prey, both by the people that support them and the ones that hate them and detract them. In popular painting, literature, and soap operas, poetry and bedtime stories, anecdotes and proverbs, birds are symbols of joy, beauty, freedom, and its absence. We're all familiar with this, I hope. Architecturally, we also find birds represented on the floors, walls, and ceilings of temples, baths, mosques, churches, houses, etc. Other birds are talismans and proud trophies of hunts and my grandmother's dinner table. In our book, we organize these birds into a structure provided by a popular song recorded in the early 40s by the very famous Syrian singer Asmahan. The complete song, which is called Nashid al-Tuyur, or bird song, acts as the table of contents and provides us our project with its title. Committed to storytelling as an act of testimony, our presentations of these songs are not recitations of facts, but rather incantations of wonder. The poetics of bird representations unceasingly challenges our abstract understandings of time, space, and their production. Bird bodies are capable of shifting scales across territories, whether moving vertically or horizontally. They disrupt nations and border connections between here and the sky, the local and the global. In their movement, they also articulate a temporal, a rhythmic diffusion. Such commanding of space and time is both sensual, effective, and translatable.
One day, I fell in love with a boy who was in love with birds. He could distinguish birds from their song. I shared this story with my friend Ali. Ali said he could also distinguish bombs from the sounds they made falling on Beirut. 18th incantation, bird song.
In 1967, the Syrian territory of the Western Jawlan was occupied, causing the displacement of 95% of the indigenous population. The Israeli military destroyed 340 villages and farms, leaving only 5 standing today: Majd al-Shams, Ain Qinia, Mas'adeh, Bqata, and Ghajar. Colonial settlements and kibbutzim were built over our villages, often using the same stones, and control was thus attempted over our land, mean, and resources. For over 5 decades, the usurping state has tried to apply its jurisdiction and laws upon this land, and the population continues to refuse this occupying power. Today, this population is primarily stateless, mostly forgotten yet archetypical of the contemporary Syrian condition of struggle against systematic violence, of basic rights, geographic appropriation, home demolition, and state surveillance. Since 2011, many in the Jawlan have chosen to participate in the popular uprising that is happening throughout Syria. In their courageous practices, we find affinities with our own modest interventions as Sijil. We are fully aware that our struggles are one, and that these multiple forms of injustice can be fought together. Denied access to groundwater, it is also in the planting and cultivation of rain-fed apples that Jawlanis have expressed their commitment to survival, resistance, and attachment to their land. In our intervention near the village of Mas'adeh, we have planted 40 trees that will bear fruit in a few years' time. Rather than providing immediate results, our orchard is an asset towards a longer-term investment in our collective future. Using our own hands in disciplinary training, it is also our aspiration to build a small house in a garden. In January, we built a birdhouse in Beirut and we sent it. It flew to the Jolene. Since our own bodies are denied the right to access this territory, architecture and its avian inhabitants are our representatives. Together, we challenge the constant aggression associated with our corrupt regimes and the occupying Israeli force. On that same plot of land, we built a scarecrow. In the Jolene and other parts of Syria, the practice of children carrying a scarecrow in a procession continues to this day, as it perhaps has for thousands of years. The scarecrow is known colloquially not as the thing that scares birds, but as al-Ghaith, the mother of rain. The popularity of a scarecrow cannot be measured by criteria of efficacy. Along with a romanticized hearth, tomb, totem, and temple, the scarecrow also belongs at the genesis of design. It hence remains a representation of an ongoing imagined confrontation between man and nature, both broken. As an incantation of hope, the scarecrow is an everyday monument that constitutes the center from which all culture emanates. If representations and images express a human anxiety about death or being forgotten, we wonder if the scarecrow is an expression of anxiety towards life. It is the ritual of planting a scarecrow an act of survival, an act of perpetual reproduction. What intentions towards what futures are inherent in the etymology of design that such a practice could entail? It is a practice that generates hope. These ideas are central to our comprehension of design disciplines, not only as problem-solving practices, and that their efficacy should not be measured by contemporary criteria of success or failure, elegance or vulgarity. Design, like alchemy, is a sincere practice of informed living, not a method for generating capital. As a collective practice, Sigil, along with our collaborators, firmly believe in the necessity of exploring design as a radical form of making and being, one that aspires towards a revolutionary moment in which we have all unwillingly found ourselves. Thank you very much.
Then maybe we take this away from you. And we put it over here. Well, thank you very much, Khaled, Jana, Salim, and Alfred. I have a question for you regarding this project in particular. You spoke about how this is the third iteration of a much longer-term project and that had different manifestations in the past in the form of a well, and then another representation at the Venice Biennale, the windmill, and the Marrakesh Biennale as well, and now this time over here. And I think one of the differences that I see, or one of the evolutions that I see in this project, is that while the two previous iterations were twofold, this one seems to me to be more threefold. So rather than just an intervention, site-specific intervention in Syria, and another representation elsewhere in a cultural context, there's also the exhibition in Syria as well. And so I just want to maybe understand a little bit more if you see the planting of the orchards and, the planting of the trees and the building of a scarecrow as part of, and the exhibition as part of the same thing, or do you actually also read it as 3 different manifestations of the project?
Go ahead. Do we need another microphone?
We'll share.
Okay, there is one over there. Yes, we do actually see them as one and same action. We consider the scarecrow the center of both culture and agriculture, and we insisted on having a kind of displaced pavilion in occupied land. We insisted on having an audience for what we're presenting to all of you here today in places where these things don't happen. We agree that it's a form of development from our previous project, where we actually had the capacity to expand our imagination of how we can intervene in Syria. I think that's it, mainly.
Could you maybe speak a little bit more about what the exhibition consists of over here as well? So what do people see when they come here, and then how it also relates to the exhibition that will be, if I understood correctly, happening in sync with the Triennale?
Well, I mean, the installation upstairs, just spatially, basically has the site in Syria where we actually intervened, split as a frieze, an architectural frieze, from which the soil kind of spills out. The soil almost representing the soil, the land, the actual land. It's almost like a model of the space in Syria, just like the birdhouse is a model of the Triennale here in Syria. And it's also the ground that we pierce the scarecrow into, which is the incantation of Al-Ghayth.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then another question, again, just bringing it back, because as Paula has mentioned earlier in her introduction, the commissions that the major commissions that are featured in Broken Nature present a long-term or longer-term research. And so that's why I would like to go back still a little bit more about the development from previous projects into this one. And in particular, you spoke about a book, a publication that accompanies the project. And in previous iterations, the book had much fewer stories, I guess. And instead, we see multiplication of these stories, but also a change in the pace about them. So I guess here I'm not just asking to elaborate on this, but also if you are maybe able to speak a little bit more about what these stories represent. How do you how do you weave them together, and what do they serve in the process of making this project happen?
I'll start with the second part of your question first, which is, I think the stories, because essentially the stories are assemblages of both bird images and texts from a 5,000-year-old history of bird images and text that we have in Syria. There's an attempt to produce, I think, a singular arc that I think we realized at the end of the process, one that tells a particular story about the relationship between us and other, but also us and ourselves. I think we, as a group, sincerely believe, whether in the previous project or in this one, that these stories are acts of, it's an ethical act of actually storytelling, and how they operate as testimonies towards violences that have occurred in the past. And the fact that we have forgotten these stories or have ignored them in many ways, I think is part of the problem, because essentially it is the very system that forgets and ignores these stories that is the one that actually produces the violence that we inhabit, or that we are subjected to be more accurate. What is the future for these projects? I think, like we often said, like we said last time we were here, we strongly believe that we operate within a realm of condemnation to hope. And we are happy, I think, to risk associating ourselves with these larger aspirations. We want nothing less than a total revolution and the end of injustice everywhere.
Great. And so do you see these, the writings of these as a kind of, if I understood correctly, a kind of like alternative history of some sort that you're trying to bring to the surface, or is it...
Yeah, I mean, that's like the role that we can play as designer, architects, artists in regards to history, doing a work that ultimately, you know, historians are perhaps doing in a very different way. What we do is that we create images and experiences, and that's, I think, like, that's our role technically, and that's like our specificity, I guess.
Great, thank you. And maybe another question is if you could speak a little bit more about the chant, the incantation that Jana recited in Arabic at the very beginning of this presentation.
So during our research and our many encounters during this process, we understood a larger meaning to what in English we call the scarecrow. In Arabic, the scarecrow is the mother of rain, a probable sign that it had a much earlier presence, a totally different symbolic function, as a sign of fertility, the same way the scarecrow is, but not by scaring birds, but by actually calling for water. The incantation is a popular incantation that is recited during the procession of planting a scarecrow that often happens, as you saw in some of the images, carried by kids at the beginning of fall or the winter, and is very popular in many areas. I'm sure it exists in many other languages in its different forms. This incantation is also one that we have written, Khalid and I, by hand, on 2 pieces of cloth of 9 meters and 40 meters that you will find as the wrapping of our scarecrow in this space.
So it's the talismanic garment that the scarecrow is wearing.
Total of 40. Total of 40.
Let's see. Okay, I think we have some time for some questions from the audience. So if anyone has anything, I don't know if upstairs also. I think we have a question here. We have 2 mics going around, so if we could.
Thank you for the beautifully crafted presentation. Very rich, very complex. I noticed you used the word incantation a lot, and you mentioned it in your last question as well. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on in terms of narrativity, how the act of chanting something, the act of performing an incantation is different from the act of telling a story? Because we've been talking a lot about storytelling in design, designers as storytellers, but I think the fact that you call on incantations as an act of hope is super strong. So can you elaborate on that? Maybe Janar, yeah.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful question that I think we need to think about more, frankly. I think there's something about the aspiration towards what in other contexts would be called the sacred, which is really about wasteful expenditure, about a total relationship between a force that is much larger than you, that operates using particular forms of space and objects and earth and things that I feel that we are trying to learn from in our projects. Obviously, we only scratch the surface when we kind of like stand next to a 1,000-year-old song that was recited by children for many, many, many centuries. But I think as a desire, that is something that we are trying to somehow achieve.
Thank you. Any other questions? Sure. You have your mic, yeah, that's right.
Was there anybody else?
No.
Okay, so I have a question for you. The four of you have successful careers on your own. You know, so Khaled, you used to be an architect, and now you're studying medieval studies. Jana, you're a great illustrator and graphic designer in Beirut. Salim, you're an architect, and Alfred, you're a visual artist. What kind of superpower does coming together in a collective give you?
Divine.
Divine.
No, I mean, it was really the necessity of, I mean, we kind of all studied together in Beirut at the American University of Beirut, and those were years that were relatively peaceful. I mean, 2003, the Iraq war started, but I mean, relatively peaceful. When the war in Syria began, it was an imperative to begin work and to react to the violence and to produce alternative narratives to what is always coming out of the region. So, so our projects are modest. I mean, they don't operate on a grand scale, but I think they are powerful because they offer another voice.
Yeah. Can I add on this? I think that there's something else that we share that we probably intuitively knew, but also discovered along the way is a redefinition of design. I mean, what we have in common as architects and designers, because Alfred is also originally a designer, is the way we have been taught, the influences we have, the dominant understanding of design in the world, but also for us in Lebanon, is one that is very deceiving. So it's a very difficult path to actually challenge it. What function can design do in society when you come also from a part of the world where war is such a strong and present moment? There's a futility that happens that you feel in relation to your superpowers as designers, as artists, as people who have the privilege to communicate publicly. So there's a real desire from all of us, and it's a path that we're walking a bit blindly to find other ways to use our skills, ways that are not functional in the way the market defines it, but that are not utilitarian, but that also recognize the symbolic aspect of our processes, that also recognize particular places of the world in where we produce, and obviously to try to find a power for our fields in moments of violent histories, I think.
Pretty great. I actually do have just a quick question, just building up on Paula's, in fact. And you all come, or at least right now, are within slightly different fields. You operate within art, architecture, design, and history, art history. So, and Salim, I know you have some opinions about that, and so I just wanted to ask about, how does each of your different trainings also inform the multiple ways that these kinds of projects that you make are produced? From the spatial to the historical.
Yeah, of course. I mean, each of us has a certain skill set and comes from a certain discipline, but we don't really believe so much in the boundaries of our disciplines. And somehow, I think what we always have tried to do is, try to work on the margins of our disciplines, and us being four different people with different practices and different disciplines, we sort of try to rub against each other in a very strange way, as
And I don't know if it's obvious, but we're also friends, so we fight a lot. But also love each other, and I feel that that's actually a very important part of our practice too. There's a lot of passion in what we do in our relationship to one another, and I think that also makes it particularly unique.
Thank you very much. We have time for one last question, if there's anyone. I think we have a question over there.
You talked about incantations and connection with the divine, and there seems to be an elemental nature to what you do, whether it's in having drawn a well or having planted plants. And I just wondered whether there was some significance to wanting to leave a mark or grow roots in a territory that maybe has been invaded and politically disturbed recently.
Well, I first need, thank you for your question. I first need to object to the recently part. We've been subjected to violence, all of us in this room, for a very, very long period of time. We haven't had the privilege of assuming a defeat or some other tragic, traumatic moment in our past. Trauma is a daily existence for all of us. The projects, all of them, at least the ones we presented today, are in Syria, a landscape that we cannot physically access for different reasons. There is something about this ability to somehow subvert the places in which power is often located or imagined to be, and reminding people around us that power actually exists somewhere else. Yes, these apple trees will only bear fruit in the next 5, 6, 7 years, but it is my hope that we will all go there at some point and have some of those apples. And if not, then the apples will come to us in the same way in which the birdhouse flew there.
No, but we don't live with trauma, we are resisting. So we're not, you know, we're resisting, and design, architecture, and art are tools of resistance, and yeah. So.
There's maybe one last thing, I think, from your question, which is that you ask about the relation to nature, actually, in our designs, and I think that somehow we never formulated that difference between us and nature, or between each one of these works and nature. So we call them monuments of the everyday because they practice on the scale of the daily, and it happens that they include digging the earth, and they include even the wind, or water, or so it is never formulated as an intention or as a, but it's, I think, inherent to to our practices that this difference between us and our environment is somehow, or at least one way to echo the theme of the Triennale, but one way to answer issues of broken nature is somehow this reconnection with this environment that for us is inherent to our practices.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. Our next panel is, as Paula said earlier, broken nature does not only mean the natural ecosystems. We look to environments, and our environment includes also social ties. And one of the biggest questions of our time at the moment is the question of migration and of borders. And borders not only affect, and migration doesn't only affect us as humans, it also brings together very different species as well, and affect different species. Our practices that we have put in place and installed also affect other species. And so for this panel we have 4 speakers, and we will start with Mauro Baracco and Linda Tegg from a project in broken nature called Grassland Suspended, which is, they will tell you a little bit more about it, but it is also a continuation of an installation that happened in the Australian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale of Architecture of last year. Their presentation is going to be followed by Irene Strakoutsis, and then Justinien Tribillon from the Migrant Journal, and finally Eyal Weizman. And after that we will also have time to all sit together and talk and open questions for the public. So Linda and Mauro, please, the stage is yours.
Sorry, is it possible to...
Let's see. You oh, it's on the table. Okay. So typical. I do too.
Hello, I'm Mauro Baracco from Baracco & Wright Architects in Melbourne. I'm going to present together with artist Linda Tegg the installation that we, the three of us, Louise, I and Linda, Louise is in Melbourne, and say hi to all of you, have done for Broken Nature. Thank you again, Paola, Laura, Ala, Erika, and Laurie, and the extended team of Broken Nature for the invitation to contribute to the exhibition and symposium. It is great to be here. This installation, Grassless Suspended, is a further extension from a project that the three of us have done for the Venice Biennale last year, when we curated the Australian Pavilion with the theme Repair, proposing a role for architecture to engage with the repair of the places it is part of, commencing with the natural environment, which we argue is instrumental in social, cultural, and economic repair. We use the word engage because there are many people and disciplines involved in the acts of repair, and because a building itself, we believe, cannot physically repair, unlike, say, landscape architecture or ecologist projects. But there are many decisions, that is, approaches, that can catalyze, enable, and engage with what requires repair. This is the cover of a repair book, and this is the back cover with an image taken by Linda, symbolic of what has been damaged, of what is in need of repair. These are grasslands on the volcanic soils to the north of Melbourne, which you can see in the distance. Only a small amount remains, displaced by Melbourne, its industry, agriculture, and urban form. Unlike much of Europe, in Australia we have a type of nature that was in balance for many thousands of years with indigenous Australians in and around our cities. This environmental injury goes hand in hand with the destructions of indigenous culture and often is now the site of contemporary urban fabrics in neglect and social and economic decline. We, Baracco & Wright Architects, have been investigating the repair of urban and natural ecologies for many years, producing academic and practice work that can be described as inclined to forms of integration between built and open vegetated space, between architectural and natural ecologies. Works that test ways to think and produce architecture so as to be less architectural, more open to otherness in the form of flora and fauna, and in so doing, capable to contribute to the repair of urban and natural environments. In the last few years, through Repair at the Venice Biennale, which you can see here, through Grassland, Suspended now for Broken Nature, and some other works currently in process for forthcoming exhibitions, we have been working in collaborations with Linda, gaining further insights and developing further approaches towards these topics through a fruitful, engaging, and positively challenging collaboration with the intellectual stance and viewpoints of an artist. As a preamble to our work for Broken Nature, the 15 Australian projects selected by Louise and me for the Biennale and shown in the Australian Pavilion through videos produced by Linda and David Fox were presenting architecture de-objectified in their place from multiple views. These videos were shown in an environment, the interior of the Australian Pavilion, where a landscape of 10,000 endemic Australian grasslands species was recreated in order to offer an opportunity to look anew at what is displaced in our use of land every day. The thousands of Australia endemic plants were brought to Italy and as seeds in 2017. They were sown and germinated in an agriculture and botany school in Liguria. They grew there and were transported to the Australian pavilion, where they were arranged into the installation curated by us. Grasslands Suspended, here with us, documents the current state of seeds that have been collected from the ground plants at the Venice Biennale, which are now suspended, as impeded by jurisdictional and legal rules to return to Australia. Literally, broken nature.
Thanks, Mauro. I'm Linda Tegg, and I'm an artist, as Mauro mentioned. Thanks. And for the last couple of years, I've been collaborating with Baracco and Wright Architects. Well, for the past decade, my recent work has been focused on bringing living animals and plants into cultural institutions that would normally only admit them as representation or as material. And after many animal works, I came to install a large-scale recreation of the pre-settlement plant community that once occupied the site on which the State Library now stands. And through all this work, I was figuring something about how we know, how we see, and how mediation and symbolic tropes can blind us to the being of others. I was also gaining a very practical understanding about how the systems and structures of our built environment actively marginalize non-humans. The hoop jumping can sometimes be absurd and sometimes quite heartbreaking. A very rewarding aspect of this work that I've been able to really develop with Mauro and Louise with Repair has been to think through how we can adapt these anthropomorphic structures and systems to accommodate otherness. Grasslands Repair was in many ways a challenging act of dislocation. We chose to bring an endangered grassland into this, still actively threatened by urbanization, into the center of one of our most prized national cultural institutions. And in doing so, our hope was to show that these systematically undervalued plants had an important and valuable place in our contemporary culture. We worked to adapt the Australian pavilion, which was designed to display and provide for a very different kind of cultural object to meet the needs of plants. This way of thinking really decentered the human and allowed us to focus on what we could do for the plants. Likewise, our current project of repatriating the seeds collected at the pavilion is making Australia's biosecurity systems and procedures quite visible to us. In a sense, we're learning about these processes in public. So these are the species that currently we're in the position of applying to have Indigenous grassland species listed to be permitted to sow in Australia. Just over half of our seeds have already been listed, and so once an improved lab in Italy provides a seed analysis certificate, we'll be able to return these seeds to Australia. And then of these 11 species, we can choose 3 to undergo a risk assessment to determine if they will become weeds if released into the Australian environment. And this process is likely to take 12 months and involve a legislative change. And the genus of these plants is not listed as known, and so they'll also have to undergo a disease risk assessment that may take up to 2 years. So it's likely, yet not quite yet known, as there's a lot not known about these plants, that these seeds may no longer be viable by the time they undergo all the risk assessments. But this type of process is really important to us as it really helps to understand the structures that both repress and protect life. And our collective work, thinking with grassland plant communities, has led us to believe that perceiving is one of the first steps to caring. And we think it seems right that these seeds be returned home. Thank you.
Okay, Irene, now we would like to welcome to the stage Irene Stracuzzi. There you go. Ciao, Irene.
Hello. I want to start by thanking for inviting me to the exhibition and to this talk today. My project deals with the current dispute in the Arctic Ocean, but before I tackle into that, I would like to explain a little bit the research behind it. So as a graphic designer, I was curious about the representation of things, and especially the representation of borders. So I looked at the history of cartography to kind of find out where bordering processes and cartography merge. So what we can see here are a few examples. This is a medieval copy of a Roman map that shows Europe as a long strip of rivers and cities with no distinction as to where the different sovereignties end or begin. And this was generally the approach adopted at the time. But a few centuries later, the first border appeared on a map. And this was drawn in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to divide the spheres of influence between the Portuguese and the Castilian crown, even though the land was not even correctly charted. But this kind of understanding changed with the arrival of the Cartesian plane. And in France, a huge line was drawn on the ground in the outskirts of Paris and then reproduced onto a map to get more precise measurements of the land. And this was not a border in itself, but really showed the possibility when a line is drawn and then made become real. And the same approach has been used in the Arctic Ocean to kind of claim sovereignty on the ocean. And the dispute supposedly started in 2007 when a Russian submarine planted a titanium flag on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. And the reason this dispute is centered in the Arctic is not incidental, because the Arctic has a history of being misrepresented in maps. And a well-known case is Google Maps, that because of the projection adopted, which is called the Mercator projection, shows the Arctic as a long strip of ocean at the top of the map. And this makes it very easy to forget about it. But even if we take into account historical maps, we can see that the Arctic was a place where a lot of information was missing and then reproduced using centuries-old tales of mythical creatures. And until today, the Arctic has been considered as a place belonging to no one, therefore open to conquest. So I decided to use the Arctic Ocean as the topic for my project, and my question was how to use information design in a way that would highlight the cartographic origin of the dispute. So the area I took into consideration is the area inside the Arctic Circle, and I used a polar stereographic projection, which is very convenient because it does not create distortion, and it also allows the viewer to access the map from 360 degrees. Well, this is a bit, it's not how it's supposed to look, but currently 5 nations can claim the Arctic Ocean, but they need to abide by a document called the Law of the Sea. And according to this law, they need to provide information that states that the area they want to claim is part of the natural prolongation of the land territory. So in practical terms, this means that these nations are setting out scientific expeditions to collect geological data, so evidence to make these claims. And according to the government of Canada itself, this means that in the Arctic, the currency of sovereignty is not military force, but it's scientific data. So in order to tell more about the issue, my project works with 2 elements. One element is a physical model of the Arctic Ocean, especially focusing on the bottom of the sea, so keeping the land flat and showing the underwater ridges and mountains. And then it works with a projection that is instrumental to show moving and changing data, but also because it's a sort of metaphor of this way, of the way we impose our cartographic understanding onto reality. So the information shows data about the decrease of sea ice, the current location of oil and gas fields, but also the different claims and the overlapping areas, which are very interesting because it means that the different nations are kind of interpreting the same data to their own advantage. So the story is told through this juxtaposition of maps in order to let the viewer kind of gather the clue and make up their own idea about the dispute. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up on stage, Justinien Trevillon.
Thank you very much to Paola, Ala, Laura, and Erika, and Laurie for having me today. It's a great pleasure to be here today. That's because Broken Nature is a project we've been following, and I say we, not as a role we, but as Migrant Journal, the team, with great interest since we've heard about it, really. There are so many projects featured today, so many people we've engaged with, research we have featured in previous issues of Migrant Journal. I'm thinking of Marco Ferrari and Studio Folder that I've met yesterday, Martin Amuzzi, who's writing currently an article for a designer and curator writing for issue 6, Irene Stracuzzi, that you've just heard, that I've never met before, but we've featured her in issue 3, so it's always a great pleasure to meet these people in person. Marina Otero Verzi, that we interviewed as part of After Belonging for first issue, and of course Ala, whose article Blood in the Water we've published in issue 3. And I'm not saying this as a way to say it's just a bunch of friends. As I was saying, most of these people I've just met or met through Migrant Journal. But I think there's a connection here, a desire to address those huge issues like nature and migration as a whole, in their interconnectedness, and to address their infrastructure in a very original and adventurous way. It's also an opportunity to meet with the pieces we've never published or that didn't work. I'm thinking especially of that email I sent to Eyal Weizmann a few months ago, inviting him to contribute and to whom he did not reply. But I'm holding no grudge, obviously, but it's a pleasure to be with him today. So, as you've seen here, there's a few slides circulating from issue 1 until issue 5. This is a way for me not to speak for too long and not having to use the clicker. What I'm going to do is to introduce the project quite quickly, especially for those of you who might not know it. Those of you who do can take a nap. I know you've partied hard yesterday. So Migrant Journal is a 6-issue publication looking at the circulation, looking at migration in all its forms. So we want to go back to the root of the concept of migration. Looking at migration not only of people, but also ideas, cultures, goods, birds, seeds, ideas, taste. We really have no boundary as to how we approach this project. We really want to go back to the root of that concept and explore it with a fresh eye, if possible, and with no clear boundaries and limits. It's a project we created in 2016. We were a team of 4 back then: Catarina de Almeida Brito, Isabel Seifert, and Christoph Miller. Isabel and Christoph are the duo forming Offshore Studio, so the graphic designers and co-editors of this project. And what we tried to do back then is to create a platform, mainly here for emerging thinkers and writers, and the reason for that word emerging is that we thought that those more established already had plenty of platforms and spaces to express their research and opinions. It's very much a multidisciplinary approach to migration. We really have no boundaries. We've published artists, journalists, philosophers, writers, sociologists, artists, I've said that before, photographers. So it's really trying to, architects, of course, urbanists. It's really a way to make sure that we engage with that topic as widely and as critically as possible. We've also now been joined by 2 new members of the team since issue 3, Michaela Busse and Damaso Randulf, who've joined us to contribute on this. And the reason we started this project is very much to address an intellectual, design and artistic response to what was then called the migrant crisis. And of course, we first started by challenging what was then named the migrant crisis. We thought that a way to address this with our own, what we did best, i.e. books, research, writing, was to do so by providing this intellectual and design-based answer, and to demonstrate how intrinsic migration is in our everyday life, either through food, taste, obviously migration of bodies and nature. We've been obviously extremely happy with the reception, and I think it's really meant a lot to a lot of researchers and a lot of people. We started with a Kickstarter campaign in April 2016 and published 800 copies. That's all the money we had for, and now we've sold more than 15 or 60,000 copies to this day. You're now seeing our fifth issue, Micro Odysseys. Each issue has a different theme. The first one was across country, so trying to look at the countryside and the rural. Our last issue published, the one you have here now, is our issue 5, looking at the very small micro odysseys. For instance, the migration of sand or the CERN. This is a piece on CERN, that research center across the border between France and Switzerland. There are so many different issues, and I can't go through them, of course, here right now on stage. I'm happy to talk about it more. But as we conclude this project very soon with our 6th issue, Foreign Agents, that's going to be released in June, it's also now a time for me, for the team, to also acknowledge the limits of this project. It's been really important for us, it's been really interesting for us to to confront ourselves with the physicality of such an object, the physicality of a project like a magazine. We wanted to create a printed publication because we thought paper ages better than digital, so that a project would have, even after it's completed, would have opportunity to keep maturing and keep being discovered. That's why we try to be present in as many libraries as we can, because we think it's really important to be present there for the future, for the widest number. So those are also the challenges that we faced, sending a copy, sending a physical issue across different countries, facing the issues around Brexit, facing the issues around borders, import, exports, and also sadly the limits of our own social networks. And now as we look at our network of contributors, but also the readers, where they are located, we find they are often mainly concentrated in Europe, mainly concentrated in Northern America, and in part in Asia. But obviously we have failed to engage with the African continent as a whole, and very much with South America as well. So it's also for us a process and a social experiment, in a sense, to reflect on our own networks and the way, even though we talk about migration, even though we picture ourselves as global people, we still are very limited and bounded by our own social networks and spaces. Thank you very much.
And now, next on stage, Eyal Weizman. Hey, ciao.
So I think this image represents one of the most kind of fundamental and influential pieces of political rhetoric articulated through architecture. And I'm showing it to you again because it's been alluded to so much in relation to migration recently as an example for, say, the American-Mexican border that need to be walled off. The wall in the West Bank has never been an instrument of migration, it's an instrument of colonization. So if that reference is made, we need to actually see its entire history. But the power of that image on the imagination of a politics drifting to the right is absolutely fundamental. We know those maps about borders or fenced up barriers coming up everywhere in the world, in Europe, around Fortress Europe, around the world, Ceuta, Melilla, the border to Western Sahara in Pakistan. and India borders. But I think what is important, and in particular a response to the idea of broken nature, is those barriers focus our attention. But in fact, what I want to speak about today is the way in which natural barriers are actually being solidified and hardened into borders. I think a very helpful term has been came up by some friends here, Stefano Boeri, John Palmesino, and others, with multiplicity, calling the Mediterranean solid sea. And in fact, the way in which water turns into, or the water are wallified, if you like, is of great interest for somebody like me that comes here from Britain right now, where the water of the English Channel are now wallified in juridical terms, in terms of trade, etc. There is a combination between a natural medium, say it's air, water, forest, the desert, etc., that is a product of environmental conditions, charge it with military practice and with legal process, and it turns into a wall. It turns into a deadly place of barrier. And indeed, the one that is relevant for this talk today is the Mediterranean, that is turned into a site in which people simply disappear on the way to Europe. And in fact, their disappearance in the sea is being designed, it's being the result of premeditated conditions of those people in Europe that do not want people from sub-Saharan Africa, from North Africa, to actually arrive at the shore. And again, it is not the sea, it is the way in which the sea is charged, the way in which the sea is practiced, if you like, the way in which nature is spun that makes that. And one of the ways of doing that is that the people who are most qualified in saving boats in distress in the Mediterranean, NGOs that have been trained and equipped to do that, are being systematically kept out of the Mediterranean by this government, also the previous government of Italy, and under EU guidelines. They're being criminalized, they're called people smugglers, their boats are confiscated, and the most important thing that they are meant to do and know how to do is not being done. I'm referring to now to a work that Forensic Architecture, the agency I run in London, is undertaking together and following the lead, in fact, of an affiliate group of us, Forensic Oceanography, Charles Heller and Lorenzo Pezzani, who have been following those issues for many years. But indeed, the kind of turning of the Mediterranean into a dark frontier that swallows people in is that it swallowed also signs. No traces left on water. There is no record. There is no account of the numbers of lives that are lost in the Mediterranean. But indeed, NGOs, the same NGOs that understand that rescuing is also documenting, turning that dark frontier or shedding light over it is extremely important. And these are images that NGO people start, in fact, producing. What you see here is attempts by us and a couple of NGOs that we work with together, Jugendrettet and Sea-Watch, to create what we call visual radar, using their images taken on GoPro cameras within boats to map out the sea and the boats within it. It is important because migrant boats and wooden boats do not have tracking data, and everything about those rescue attempts that are being criminalized is to do with the architecture of the sea, i.e. the relationship between boats within it. I'm going to give you a quick example of an incident that happened in June 2017, a very routine, in fact a successful rescue operation of migrant in distress in the southern Mediterranean by a German NGO called Jugendrettet on the boat Juventa, and that was making trouble in Italy here. And the government obviously wanted those people out of the water, these NGOs, to be confiscated, and claimed, amongst other things, using this image, that, and I think most of you can actually read it, but for those of you who can't, that the rubber boat is operated by the NGOs, is actually towing this empty migrant boat after the successful operation towards the Libyan territorial water. That was articulated as a proof that those NGOs are colluding with smugglers because they're supplying them back the boats in order to bring in more people, something that we might think is understandable, but legally is a problematic practice. But what in this image actually tells us which direction that boat is being towed? Again, in the Mediterranean or in any sea, there is hardly any element to give directionality, so they could put any claim on it. In fact, there isn't one element in this image that would give you direction, and that's the direction of the waves. And of course, what we could do is track those waves by using motion tracking, look at different details within it, and build a very careful, systematic, three-dimensional model of the water that would look very carefully at the way and the patterns of behavior of waves in the sea, and compare it, obviously, to open source data about waves and currents in the Mediterranean, which exist. One can find it, and when you do it seriously, when you do it systematically, you see that actually the NGO is towing the migrant boat northwards, that is, away from the Libyan coast. So you would say this is an open and shut case. This thing was presented and is going to be presented in a number of legal cases trying to release that boat, which is confiscated in Trapani and not allowed to participate in rescue operation. Now it's all sort of technical issues that make this boat still within harbor, and we still haven't been able to help release it. So again, the people who are most qualified are leaving the Mediterranean. Mortality likely increases. There is, again, very hard to track numbers of deaths. And the other technique that I wanted to show, also exercised by the Italian state. In fact, this is not the current Minister of Interior, of course, you have another one now, but the previous one has given a gift to Libya, a boat, a military boat, to actually intercept migrants in the sea and bring them back to Libya. They also trained the Libyan Coast Guards, they provided other assistance, repaired some boats, etc. That led to an event in November 6, 2017, that we are still investigating. Another legal case that is going to go into European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Here is an activist setting a camera on her boat, the Sea-Watch, and this is what happened. A migrant boat, as emergency as could be, is deflating in the middle of the Mediterranean in international borders. An SOS call is coming. Two boats come there, the Libyan Coast Guard and the NGO people respond to it. The military boat, the same one given as a present by Italy to Libya, is charging at the boat. This is the wrong way to rescue people. In order to rescue people at sea, you need to keep distance, take a little rib, a small boat out, you bring the people into it, and from it to the larger boat. That larger boat charging at the little one immediately results in the drowning of 5 people. More people are scattered in the water as the NGO people are coming, and then start a conflict, in fact, by which here the people in the Libyan Coast Guards are starting to throw hard objects at the NGOs who are trying to rescue people. And you would see soon a kind of so initially a kind of a hindering, they're trying to get them off that site. They're going to throw now a hard object. We think it's a potato, but we don't know exactly what it has been. And you would see the result of that practice. If you look carefully at the footage now, you would see what is about to happen. So they're throwing objects. The captain of that boat decides to actually start taking distance from it, and that person who would have been saved at that particular moment is reaching the water, and his life are going to be lost. The way in which we are undertaking those studies are always by creating multiple perspectives. Here now we're moving to the cameras on top of the mothership of the NGO, the Sea-Watch, and we would look at the back of the Libyan Coast Guard and into one of the most probably heartbreaking scenes that we've seen in forensic architecture. I can assure you we're seeing a lot of heartbreaking scene, a man drowning without any help, just right next to the Libyan Coast Guard boat. Those that actually made it to the boat has been imprisoned, beaten up, and sent back to Libya, where they are going to be held in some kind of, I have no other words for it than concentration camp. The responsibility for that is Europe's. Europe has actually created this protocol, supplied it, charged it, and benefits from it. And therefore the claim against Italy is happening in the European Court for Human Rights. But the activism around that includes collaboration with groups in Libya, migrants in Europe, lawyers, NGOs, etc., that aim to use those incidents, the kind of counter-analysis of incidents, in order to show the contradictions in this policy and show its full horror and try, in fact, to liquefy again that natural border. Thank you.
I'm gonna actually, you can sit there. We have a really little extra program, but please, you can sit there. So thank you so much, Eyal. Justinian mentioned Studio Folder and Italian Limes, and Studio Folder are also the designers of the whole Broken Nature installation and international participations. They cannot be here today because they've had enough of us and they have other meetings, but we would like to play a 1.5-minute video of their Italian Limes project because it relates to this directly. Please, if you can, play the video. Thank you.
Thank you all for the presentations. Just a few words on the video that we just saw by Studio Folder. The project was exhibited in the 2014 Venice Biennale of Architecture. And I guess I can try singing, maybe. Yeah, so the project actually traces the borders at between Italy and Austria in the Alps, in the Alpine region. And in fact, they had a live drawing machine and a sensor that was placed on site that would retrace the borders in real time, you know, as an effect, the changing borders actually, as an effect of melting glaciers. I can call all the speakers back up on stage, so Justinien, Irene, Mauro, and Linda, to have a conversation. And I believe I need to take a chair. There's also some water around if anyone wants some water before we start speaking. And do we have another mic on the other side maybe? Yes, perfect. Ah, perfect. So, super. So maybe we could just, you know, pass them around. No, when the conversation is happening. So wonderful. So thank you all for your very inspiring presentations and for showing us different ways, really, and different entry points towards the topic of migration and of borders. I think each in a different way you have shown also the merits and the value in representing borders and trying to make apparent certain elements about borders in a way to kind of think about the value of design in communicating to people very dense and complex issues. So from, you know, the suspended seeds that are not allowed to go back home because of really like self-imposed borders somehow, or like imposed borders on species that had nothing to do with the installment of these practices, to trying to understand and to map out the shifting borders and the shifting politics, I guess, behind a natural resource. And as we saw with Eyal, the solidification of the water that then becomes also a kind of opportunity to chart that territory and to draw that territory and make it less abstract in a way. And then with Justinien and, you know, also trying to visualize and trace a line between different types of migration and how we relate to the concept itself. And so we cannot, as we have seen, we can no longer think of borders as just like, you know, a very simple moving from one place to the next, or just placing a barrier. And I guess my question for you is, how do you see each individually your practices in kind of really providing a more layered understanding of the situation that we are living in right now in terms of migration? And so maybe actually, Justinien, I would start with you and perhaps ask about, you know, all the intentions, also the visual intentions that are behind a project like the Migrant Journal, and how that allows a new understanding and a more layered comprehension of the topics.
As you've seen, I haven't had much time to talk about graphic design and the way we've worked. Obviously, it's all thanks to the excellent work of Offshore Studio, Isabelle and Christophe, who've been doing so much research into how to how to think maps differently, how to think representations differently. And we really wanted to push ourselves, both editors and designers, to push ourselves as far as possible and say, we want to do something which is both in terms of its intellectual content and its design, which is as forward-thinking as possible, and we want to push our arts in a way to say so. What's been really interesting is that, I mean, there are, let's face it, loads of people read or buy or take a copy of Migrant Journal because it looks amazing. And I know for a fact that so many of them do not read it at all, but already sensible to the way it looks, the way the cover appeals to them. what has been really interesting for me, what has added to my understanding of graphic design is when we released issue 1. Sorry, I love to share. When we released issue 1, it's the issue which is a green cover, and that's copper, but copper metallic color, which actually looks like gold a bit. And the reaction that copper was meant to represent the earth, because it was an issue about countryside. And when we released that issue and we first presented it at book fairs and in bookshops, some people were shocked because they were telling me, you can't talk about migration and have a gold and use gold color. That's absolutely out of, it's not the right thing to do. And it was really interesting. It was obviously in 2016, so the migrant crisis, using quotation marks, was at its peak, or we thought it was its peak, or a peak. So it was very much a topic that was present to everybody's mind. And for me, it was striking to have a discussion about a color and how this does not match a topic like migration. And I think that's very much part of the project, and that's also why we decided to name it Migrant and Migration, first as a way to challenge that word of migration and to challenge the prejudice about migration. And that happens through words, through editing, and through graphic design.
Thank you. Eyal, I think my next question goes to you. And so I was really, it was very striking to me seeing the image where it shows the boat that was being pulled, and then really nothing that could orient us besides the kind of waves that were on the surface of the water, which were indicative of wind direction, right? And that can produce a kind of chain of different investigations in order to really start trying to retrace and remap the space where this picture was taken and the events that are behind it. My question, I guess, is how much of what the forensic project is about is scientific, and then how much is it also tying a narrative together as well, or like a counter-investigation, a counter-narrative, as you say. So, and where do the limitations lie in a project like that?
I think that the challenge right now to anyone that is working on politics is really how to bring nature into our narrative that we need to tie together. And I think that in as much as governments weaponize natural elements, water, deserts, the Sahara Desert, etc., the Alps, against migrants. A way to tune, to listen to those natural elements, to wind, to wave, is bringing another kind of witness, another kind of testimony. This is not human, but needs to be tied in with human ones. So already, the minute that you bring nature in, you need to bring some science in. And I think that when scientists and artists, I'm not going to say anything controversial here, when scientists, artists, designers work together, we can produce something else. But what we need is a kind of an understanding that dealing with nature, with broken nature, with weaponized nature, is not simply a domain of science, that it needs to bring together the human voice, it needs to bring together forms of activism, it needs to bring together the victims of a certain atrocity, let's say it like that, and that we need to create another kind of cacophony of types of voices, and that's the only way to deal with this kind of situation. We cannot cut it apart. Second thing that I'd like to say is that I do not think that we need to, or we can anymore, separate representation from political action. I think that political representation right now has been turned into such a form of violence. This is not simply representing violence, not simply speaking about violence, and it's simply exposing violence, resisting it through an act of entering into a form of activism that is simultaneously descriptive and projective, that tries to do something through creating the counter-narrative. This is a very simple example. I mean, this is like a sort of a 10-second clip in a video that is up there that is 40 minutes long, that ties in voices and all sorts of other things. But that's the idea of counter-investigation. You bring in the waves into the conversation, and the waves contradict the Italian government.
Right, at a moment where the water itself is being used as a weapon as well. Yeah. So now, Irene, maybe you have something to say in that to that effect as well about the representation and the politics behind representation, and how representation is in fact a political tool, and we see that very clearly in your project. So maybe you want to just elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. And the reason actually why I chose the Arctic as a case study to work on it, it's because it's the only place, or one of the few places, where borders are completely reliant on maps, and in that sense. That's also why my project only shows map through tell the story, and it's kind of a formal exercise to really make people understand how deeply the impact maps can have.
Especially in an age where, you know, the very natural resource itself is not stable, and how do we trace it, how do we represent it, how do we show it to people becomes very important. How do we tell the story of it? Mauro and Linda, I was wondering during your presentation at some point if the process of bringing back the seeds that were cared for and collected from Venice was something that had entered the process of the project from its initial stages, or was it maybe, you know, like, was this something that the process of trying to bring them back started prior to Venice, or did it just kind of happen while the installation was going on? And then, you know, so was there an intention in the conception of the project itself, and how does that affect then what do we do with the seeds, and how much time it would take, especially that the seeds are only viable for a couple of years or so?
Okay, so I think when we began the project, there was so much unknown, and so we could predict that that there would be seeds, that there would be the progeny of the plants that we would have to deal with, but or that we would have to work alongside, but we didn't really know exactly how that was going to manifest, or if the plants were going to thrive in the pavilion as they did. So I think that we were learning a lot about the plants as we created a situation where those plants were living now in Italy. And then over the course of the time, working with plants takes time. So over the course of that time, then we started to think about, oh, well, can we actually bring the plants back? Can we bring the seeds back? And we're sort of learning about it from within it.
And if you know, the seeds are not to be returned in time, what happens? And then how does that affect the way we think about the implications of producing a project like that in the future? And, you know, trying to consider the different elements that tie into displacing a portion of, or like another species somehow, and then trying to return it back to its home place.
Yeah, I think all these complicated positions are really interesting, and we're really interested in thinking into them and, you know, working those things through. It's obviously a situation that we created, and so it will allow us to reflect back upon that as we go.
If I can say just one. So yes, we are in the situations of the seeds, which is a very interesting conundrum to be with. You know, we are in the Anthropocene. We are definitely not advocating for deep nature or So that's an interesting, we somehow have also contributed to invade some parts of Venice with some plants, because there were visitors at the end who came and took some of their plants to put in their garden. But one other important thing, I would like to go back 1 second to your initial question of the borders, is that what this exhibition in Venice was trying also to provoke is the fact that, and this is where also it's difficult to reconfigure cities at the thinking on the fact that our cities are still pretty much defined by strong borders, you know, the engineering borders that make the borders between the footpaths, the curb and channel system, and that's fundamentally a concern, strong concern, simply because that's a border that really needs to be totally rethought in order to, if we want to be serious about the possibility to design a resilient city. Paola in an interview saying we are going to disappear, we already know this, that's fine, I don't have any problem with that. We don't know when, but probably we are. But in doing this, if we really want to take care of the otherness that will survive us, then how can we try to convince politicians? And these are the conversation we are having, we are trying to have, not just between architects, but especially with politicians and urban planners in Australia, and especially there, how to rethink substantially the way of reimagining cities without the borders that for years have totally defined our cities.
Thank you. I think we can open the floor to a question or two. We don't have much time, but if anyone has any questions, please just raise your hand. I don't know if I can. Oh, there's one right there, in fact.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this session was really scientific, as you said. I'm a scientist myself, a climatologist, and I would like to, maybe there's no time for it, but ask everybody of you whether you really feel you work from a platform now where scientists and artists and designers work together, or there's still a lot to be done to create that platform where scientists and artists and designers work together. From your own practice, do you work on your own and you use scientific data, but you don't talk to scientists, or is it different?
I will be very quick. I just submitted an application to the Australian government before flying 3 days ago with 3 ecologists, and I'm an architect. It's by working in this way that we can probably be more effective.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time with, in conversation with scientists. Last year I spent a year embedded in the School of Geography at Melbourne University, and spent a lot of time listening and trying to understand their thinking, and then come at it from an artist's point of view.
In my own practice, I always try to go to scientists first, but I would really love to be asked by scientists themselves to act on projects, because as designers, we only have so much information about specific things, whereas I think, especially thinking about my own practice, I would really like to engage more in conversations.
I'm not sure first how to define scientists. I come from social science, so we often, described as not being scientists at all. So there's a question there, and but what's been, to dodge, slightly sidestep your question, because I think Ayala has more to say about this than me, but what's been really interesting is to see through Migrant Journal the desire from some of the contributors, may they be scientists themselves, hard science, math, biology, to play with facts, and how they've used Migrant Journal as a platform to sort of go into blurred waters between fact and reality, and scientific facts and reality. And that's been really interesting for me to witness and to see. It's not something I would have done for my own research and writing practice, but it's been really interesting to see that there's a desire from that generation, well, let's put it that way, to really also play with, fake news, fake information, and that very complex, complicated and blurry lines between scientific facts and the artistic license and the freedom of playing with narration, narratives, and fiction.
So I think the question is really how you work with scientists. I mean, I think that all of us here work with some elements of science. I think the problem was that critical and artistic aesthetic practices were kind of aligned against the sort of positivism of science. That was the habit. That was kind of like the default action. Or we were taking scientific data, as you said, and we were representing it, making it more accessible, kind of like information design to a certain extent. And I think that the challenges of our work right now is that the architect, the artist, and the scientist are all investigators, each one having their own particular skill set. So it's not a work in a sequence in which one represents the work of the other, but something that is maybe more akin to kind of like the way in which arts and sciences were aligned to each other in the 16th century. A kind of a project of description that is now obviously very different, but political description, the description and creation of facts. And I think particularly this is important, and you mentioned it, when in the sort of dark epistemology of the post-truth era, nature is the biggest and #1 casualty, right? And I'm referring to the climate change discussion and their negation, i.e. the very acts of observation, description, the kind of patience that you speak about that is necessary both to cultivate and to look at a garden, and the garden that is the earth perhaps, need that kind of care of look, representation, and protection that have become part of the same practice. So it's not, it is really about that, the slow attuning to the facts, in the way that they're represented in image or in data or in any kind of other sensor, needs to be thought, I think, together. And so that is really the challenge, that we're not, referring to each other, but creating a kind of entangled new form of practice.
Thank you.
Any other questions? There's one over here. There are a couple over here, in fact.
Up the mezzanine as well.
Up there. Amira.
Thank you. I'm very interested to hear more about the any practical examples you have to offer of the way you're using design, or the tactics of using design as an activist practice. And we heard the use of design to introduce representations of more witnesses or evidence into a court system, but the way that design or that representation plays a certain role in a specific place in this court to exercise power to try and create an effect, which is kind of the activism that you're practicing. But I was interested to hear more examples from the panel. Thanks.
I can start by referring to prosaic examples in the way we design, literally design as architects. We always keep in mind how to create some space that can be beneficial to otherness more than to human, also to human. But and so in some of our projects, we have really consciously, even small projects, we have been camping 2 or 3 years before deciding exactly where to, where was the most suitable position, ecologically speaking, and how to recreate, how to have some architecture that can really act in order to contribute to green corridors, to animal corridors. So, And this is something that obviously it's possible to do possibly in certain parts of the world rather than other parts of the world, but I think that could be done everywhere relatively in accordance really, to where architecture are. So these are the things that really interested us at the moment.
For us, I guess with a kind of background in architecture, we understand that a case needs to be constructed. And what goes into the case is a kind of a huge multiplicity of otherwise incompatible things, no? Waves and testimonies and drawing and satellite image and this and that. And the idea, the act of verification as a truth practice, involves social relation with people on the ground, involves a certain literacy in reading images, a certain scientific literacy in working with experts of different forms. And the design, if you like, or the architectural act is the assembly from them of a case. And a case needs to, for us, when we present a case in court, you need to understand that the court is the most kind of violent, confrontational arena ever. It's like your worst crit. And they poke hole in everything that you have said. And so if you put a construction, it needs to hold. And obviously, it's the joints, it's the little cracks that, if with a good defense lawyer, they're going to make it fall. So you need to also know how to build it, present it, and defend it. So that involves both the act of sensing, of constructing an evidence, and your rhetorical power in defending that. Because after all, you know, it's an act of conviction when you are in court, not only conviction in the sense of guilty verdict, but to convince people, to create a sense of affirmed belief. And that is something that I think we have as aesthetic practitioners, a kind of an edge on in.
I think we had another question over there. There's also upstairs.
I think it's actually a fantastic question because it really ties the question of migration back to the question of the earth. And migration is a certain movement, if you like, across a surface that is continuously transforming. And desertification, deforestation, toxication of certain lakes or water sources obviously lead to induce migration. Not only am I willing, we are actually doing that. This is part of our work when we look at the entire itinerary, the entire trajectory of migration from, say, the fluctuation of the aridity line in the Sahel and the kind of the burning of fields, the loss of seeds, of agricultural practices, all the way towards the way in which the Sahara itself has become deadlier, and as people are channeled into areas that are more arid within that. So it's the idea, though, that we cannot look at those things separately. No, I mean, climate change and the question of migration and the question of the neo-colonial war are actually entangled. And just one little point about that. As somebody coming from a human rights background, I'm always surprised that even the most radical activists, climate change activists, consider the warming, the climate change and global warming as the collateral damage of history. We want to travel, we want to increase productivity, good or bad. We produce plastic, and then, you know, shit happens. The planet temperature rise. In fact, if you look at climate change from a colonial perspective, you would see that, first of all, the first time climate change is mentioned is in the writing of colonial administrators in the 18th century as a project. This is what they want to do. They take over places that are too hot for them because they're Europeans, so they want to cool them. They go to areas that are too humid, like the rainforest. They want to moderate them. And the way to moderate them is through a kind of an engineering of the earth. Climate change begins as a colonial project and as an engineering problem, not as a collateral of it. And I think, you know, again, going back to Israel-Palestine, the biggest Zionist slogan is, let the desert bloom. What is that if not a kind of a climate change as an intentional project? That blooming of the desert, quote unquote, has went hand in hand with the displacement of the indigenous people of these areas.
If I can just jump on your questions and Ayal's answer, and also tie it back to the previous question on the role of design. What's really fascinating with the project we see here today and with forensic architecture's work, and with your questions, is how, as you've just said, how all these issues are interconnected and how they're extremely complex. And in a sense, it's so difficult to fathom and to really take into consideration. And there's something that sort of goes beyond us. What strikes me today is that fight, that conflict between, you know, facts, scientific facts, truth, and, for instance, the rise once again of plot theories. You know, that Rothschild is the Rothschild banks are governing the world and that kind of thing. And there are so many. I don't know if you've ever been on those YouTube channels, you know, with plot theories and sort of really complex narratives to explain how the world is organized in a very simple way that sort of catches your inspiration, catches your imaginaries. And it's fascinating to see the conflict between those stories, sort of those movements between nature, between migration, between politics, sort of in opposition to all these plot theories, all these people who want to believe stuff which are factually false. So the question is maybe how can we change the balance and make sure that there is a desire and there is an open-mindedness to accept all these narratives, all these big big movements and big trends, and there is a desire for people to understand them and to approach them through design, through science, and through fiction, in order to sort of combat that appetite today for fake news, for plot theories that sort of comfort you in your own position and in your own beliefs, which is for me something extremely concerning and that frightens me a lot as I see it rising once again.
Thank you. I think we should stop with the questions for the sake of time. We will be breaking right now for lunch, and we'll be back here at 1:50 sharp to start with the third commission. In fact, Video, Binary, Oxman, and the Mediated Matter group. Thank you.